When exactly is attack better than defense, defense better than health, and by how much? In other words, if I have an armament or a piece of equipment that's giving me a bunch of attack versus some amount of health, like which should I care about more? And I have given a general rule of thumb in the past that generally you want health more than defense, defense more than attack, and sometimes I've said that you'd rather have 2% of attack for each 1% of health, and it was an oversimplification, okay? But with the release of armaments into the game, people have taken a much bigger interest in sorting out the nitty-gritty of exactly how much you would rather value health, defense, attack, all damage, etc. And the good news is that although I spent over 4 years ago, many hours proving the relationship and value between health, defense, and attack. And don't worry, I'll have a video at the end. You can go check it out. That video I did over 4 years ago, showcasing this. Other folks have gone in and done the hard work of actually putting together very detailed spreadsheets that account for more of the variables than certainly I was. For example, we know there's diminishing returns on stats, so what you use on a certain commander pair makes a really big difference. Philip is going to care about very different stats, okay, than you'd get on Liu Che or Ragnar. And there's a bunch of reasons why that's the case, but let's get into some of the details. If you wanted a rule of thumb to try to break down how much do I value this versus that, well, let's pull up this sheet. Shout out to Ruz, who organizes the King's Codex, linked in the description. Who introduced me and showed me this sheet made by Davor. Davor is from Kingdom 3265, and I had a chat with them to try to understand the value of each stat relative to another based on what combo you're using and more. And this is a detailed sheet that, as an example for infantry, says, hey, if you have Ragnar and Skippy Prime, you're using France as your civilization. Here's the relationship between all damage, health, defense, and attack. For each 1% of all damage, you'd want about 2% of health, 1.95, 2.54% of defense, or 2.68% of attack, and those are all even. Now, this is a very grand oversimplification, even though it is very detailed in its evaluation. And the reason is that, as described in the README, there's only so many things that can be accounted for. For example, it's not going to account for your rate of rage generation. And I'm not going to go through all of the nitty-gritty details here. The value I find in lists like this is not to try to nitpick like a difference of 0.00001, but instead to look for really big jumps in the results. The times where, wow, suddenly I care about health a lot more than I did attack. Why? And to double click into those situations. But one thing that is really interesting to look at is just the difference between civilizations. And why don't we start there? Let's say you've got this base set of equipment as shown on the left, and you're using Ragnar and Skippy Prime, and you have France or you have Ottoman. What's interesting is that if you are France, 1% of all damage is worth about 1.95% of health. Whereas with Ottoman, 1% of all damage is worth 1.92% of health. Now, the reason this will be different between the two is that France has an infantry unit that has base stats for infantry. It's easy to forget that when we talk about percent boosts in this game, it's a percent boost on the base stats. France has an infantry special unit, and that is why there is a slight difference between France, which has an infantry special unit, and Ottoman, which has a archer special unit. Now look, at the end of the day, the difference here is so small that I would say I kind of don't even care, right? Like, this is the level of difference that I'm not all that interested in. But the level of difference where I am very compelled is where we look at, wait a minute, Liu Che pair with Philip, 1% of all damage is worth 1.38% of health. In other words, on this combo, health is way more valuable. You need way less health to be the equivalent of 1% all damage. Now, like I said, this is all a grand oversimplification, even though it is very detailed and intentional in the way that it's done its evaluation, because like, if you're free damaging somebody and they're not targeting you and you're not taking any damage at all, then of course all you really care about is pushing those damage stats. Like, as an example, in Ark of Osiris, if you want to swarm a garrison and capture it, you don't really care about your effective trade. What you really care about is doing so much damage that hopefully you take the garrison regardless of your savs. In fact, in some ways you hope to sad face, because when you sad face, you can get back home faster. So there are situations where like you want lots of health versus you want lots of attack. This is trying to figure out your general overall effectiveness and elevating it. And sometimes that means taking less damage, and sometimes that means dealing more damage. But what situation you're in obviously makes a huge difference here. So again, it's an oversimplification, but still very interesting. Like I said, for looking at huge differences in numbers, and this, I would argue, is a big difference. If I use Ragnar and Skippy Prime, I care about all damage a lot more than if I'm using Liu Che and Philip. And when you actually think about that, what I just said, it makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? It makes a lot of sense that you care about health much more on Liu Che Philip, because Philip is not doing active skill damage, right? Only one of two commanders in this pair does active skill damage. So to improve your effectiveness in the open field, health plays a much bigger role because Philip's not doing big damage on his active skill. It makes perfect sense, actually. And there are very, very real world implications of that very simple understanding, okay? So if I were to just hide this for a second, and we go in game and we just look at some armaments, these are my echelon armaments on Trajan right now, I've got this fearsome inscription. It does 1% all damage. Well, guess what? All damage is one of the less important things to have on a march like Trajan, because Trajan doesn't do active skill damage, obviously. Now, this is designed for an open field march eventually. The second commander will be Ragnar, and he'll do damage. But even then, to just improve my overall effectiveness, health is much better in that context than it normally be. So if I could switch out Fearsome for Fit, which gives 3.5% health, that actually would be a pretty meaningful change to the sort of form and function of this army. Now, that said, you can't exactly do that. You can't just free switch to whatever you want, and I don't think I have the sort of health I would need here. But things like Guarded get a lot more interesting. Mitigating the damage you take, obviously, on a march like Philip, is way better than dealing damage. Here's Bluster. This is kind of an interesting one. Resist a control effect, but I'm not using it because it's low defense and low health. I care about those a lot. So I'd need to find like a fit armament, and. You get the idea. This is why the rare inscription, by the way, for this particular slot is really, really good on Echelon, because it's mitigating damage. But I'm getting ahead of myself here, right? So when we go back to this spreadsheet, the main sort of takeaway that I'm looking for is there some combo that really cares about, health a lot more than others? And Philip is one of those commanders where that's the case. Now, obviously, there's a little bit of difference here between Liu Che, Alex, and Wallace and Liu Che. And a part of the sort of details of that has to do with the balance of defense and health. And the reason that the balance of defense and health would change between these different combos is obviously different commanders have different stats that they're giving. And the way that the damage equation works for Rise of Kingdoms, again, this is a grand oversimplification, is that generally speaking, you get more value per point of stat if you get your defense and health closer and closer together. So the more disproportionate your defense and health are from each other, the less benefit you'll get from, increasing your, let's say it's defense that's really high. Increasing your defense, I'm making up some numbers here, by 10% may not be as big a deal as increasing your health by 5%. Like getting these numbers close together is really good. You don't really want to lower any number. You want to raise all the numbers. But anyways, all that to say that as we look at this sheet and we scroll down to the best gear set they have in here, which is the KVK stuff, weapon and helmet, along with the chest and legs, Eternal Knight and Hope Cloak, and the two set pieces and a ring and a horn. These are all iconic tier 1, by the way. So this could change a little bit for higher iconic tiers. But when you look at this, health is almost as valuable as all damage. Like 1.2% of health is worth 1% all damage. So for your Philip March, okay, all damage would be a bad choice. If you use Echelon formation, which I was just showing you as an example, all damage is not a good stat to have. You'd rather have health. It's actually just more valuable to have health. And ideally that health roll would be high, but it is what it is. And, this is true of other troop types as well, which we're going to go look at in just a second. We're starting it with infantry. We'll go to the Cavs, etc. Right? But I thought this was really interesting to look at as we sort of went through this. And again, I wouldn't sweat the details of 0.03 difference here. I would just look down at the big numbers and how they change. It is also interesting to sort of look at the relative value of health versus defense versus attack. But it generally goes almost exactly as I would say that you generally would want health, then defense, then attack. It is interesting for this march, it's signaling that actually you would value attack slightly more than defense in this one situation, this situation as well. And I think maybe they just really don't have a lot of attack stats on Liuchev Philip. Is that what that is? We could go get a look at this really quickly. Okay, we could just confirm. So we go back over here. We get a look at Philip. We look at his stats. What is he doing for us? For infantry, you're gaining defense. You also take less damage or deal more damage, and that's it. So no stats besides, I can see why attack would be valuable, actually. You're actually weirdly and strangely a march that's low on attack. That's kind of curious. I wonder if this is with KVK technology maxed. This is probably in the README assumptions that I would need to double check on. But then if we go get a look at Liu Che, what stats is he giving? He's giving defense. Okay. He is giving attack just a little bit. That's very interesting. All right. I still think that for approximate ratios, this sheet is very interesting to get a look at. And let's go get a look at the other troop types. So let's go get a look at cavalry, shall we? Let's scroll all the way down to what if you're using the best gear? And let's see if we can draw some conclusions here. And generally speaking, health is not as valuable as it is for infantry. And why would that be the case? Because the base cavalry gear has more health. So health is not as valuable here. You see it? Health is still very valuable and is the most valuable stat pretty much almost across the board, but not quite actually. Interesting. So there are some situations on cavalry where you care about the defense more. That's very interesting. So the reason you would care about the defense more is, again, because this equipment that you see here is all health, and I can show this to you. So for cavalry, the implication is that when we look at this gear, the chest is health, the gloves are health, the legs are health, the boots are health. So you could even make the argument that maybe you shouldn't go and build these pieces. Weirdly enough, the set pieces you could argue for making those. I will argue that getting the patterns here for free is huge wins, or very cheaply is a huge win, and it lets you focus on other parts of your account. But if you were min-maxing, you'd have to look closely at, actually, maybe I might prefer some defense here. And if we go look at what the Cav set offers us, right? We swing on here. You could maybe make the argument that for Cavs, you might enjoy these, or in the very least, they could be nearly as good. This gives attack. Attack for Cavs was not as valuable. So the legs are not as valuable. I guess maybe we stay away from the defense. But you can, and there's less, is there less defense here? I think there is slightly less defense. 7.5 defense versus on these gloves, 8% health. Right. All right. So it's very close. It's very, very close. We swing on into this sheet again. This is very interesting. What other conclusions can we draw here? So for some cavalry marches, you care more about defense than you do for health. Interesting. Attack is generally pretty valuable relative to health on these marches. And that's because the only piece of equipment that is giving you attack is your weapon. Right? Again, I have to go understand the KVK technology. What does it say? Technology from Alliance, SOC Crystal Tech is included. All right. We have SOC Crystal Tech included here. Okay, cool. Any other big conclusions that I would draw from this? I don't think so. Let's jump ahead now to the archers. All right. And let's get a look at this. So if we scroll on down to the finest set of gear, we need to differentiate between these two sets of gear. So the interesting thing about the 6-piece archer set is that it gives you a health bonus. So because you have more health percentage, it may not be as valuable here. Let's get a look. So generally, health is still better than defense for archers. Okay. And defense is still generally just better than attack. And this 2-to-1 ratio holds approximately true, where like 1% all damage is worth about 2% health. Interesting. And there is this other set of gear that we do need to talk about, which is using the leadership legs and boots and using the KVK weapon and helmet, which I think if you were a rally or garrison, a lot of people would argue is sort of the meta here. If we get a look at this, here we can see, oh, wait, there are some situations where you'd rather have defense, and it's with Shajar. And that kind of makes sense, actually, if you're using Shajar, because she gives, what, 35% health for archers? Interestingly, the Zhuge Liang Philip pair, Zhuge Liang has a ton of health. Okay, so Philip doesn't, but Zhuge Liang does. Or does Philip have a bunch of health? Hold on. Now we need to jump back in game. And if we pair Philip with archers, what's he got? Well, this is interesting. It is health. Ha 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 ha. So if you pair Zhuge Liang with Philip, suddenly it makes sense why this sheet is saying actually what you want is defense, because Zhuge Liang has health, like what, 30%? Philip's got 35%. And so defense is the best stat on this march. So interesting. So interesting. So I guess most people are using Zhuge Liang and Hermann Prime. And if you're using that, it's health, then defense, then attack. And it's the sort of balance of things that we've been talking about. Now, again, the value of attack is elevated dramatically if you think that you're going to be dishing out damage in a way that you're not going to be taking damage back, or attack is better in situations that's not represented here if you want to rush down the target like in Ark of Osiris. So as an example, this set of equipment that I made for infantry that I can show you over here is actually designed primarily originally when I made it for Ark. And it's got the 4-piece bonus, which gives march speed. Of course, that's amazing in Ark, and 5% attack. And also the chest has attack and the legs have attack. But on this particular set, let's see if this is in the sheet here. I don't know if it is. Do we have the full infantry set? We do not have the full infantry set to look at. But in this world where I've stacked tons of attack, like attack is the least important stat to put onto this march in the armaments by like a real long shot. And you can see I've reflected that here ever so slightly. And at the end of the day, it's that ever so slight shift that we're really talking about. Although I look at this now and I say, well, replacing Spiked would be a pretty big deal and Infamy would be a pretty big deal. Those would be two really good ones to replace. But let's talk about that for a minute. Spiked is 3.5% all attack. Oh my God. I'm a little tired. Long night, family's sick, got a stomach bug. So in this same spot, if I wanted, I could replace that with 1% all damage. So using the spreadsheet, I could scroll on down to my approximate set of gear. This set of gear is not represented though. But we'll just go with the sort of meta set that's in here. And I can show that to you right over here. All right. If we look at this, we can say Ragnar Skippy. It doesn't really matter. I'm neither France nor Ottoman, but I am an infantry civ. So we'll just look at the France line. I'm Greece. And we can see that 1% all damage is worth about 3% attack, which would mean in this scenario, the 3.5% attack is better than the 1% all damage, right? The Spiked actually is better than the all damage, theoretically, in a KVK situation. Now, obviously, there's like a lot of assumptions going into all this, and they matter. And so I'm not looking for the micro optimizations. I'm just looking for the big trend changes and shifts where like actually you care more about defense or you care more about health. And the general rule of thumb I still think is very useful, even though the details of this sheet and what's in here may change, right? And I'll have a link down below in the description if you want to go check it out. As I said, I think the direction of the learning is still really valuable, okay? And to have a tool like this, I think is also very helpful. So big shout out again to Davor for putting this together. I think that's sort of the conclusions I've drawn, and applying this just very, very, very tactically to my own equipment. We know that, as an example, I use Zhuge Liang and Hermann Prime. And we can see that my defense and health numbers are kind of low. Those are actually really valuable, and I should have more of those. Like, we can say, okay, on this armament, 1.5% all damage is worth what? Well, let's go to the sheet and find out, right? So we pull this up, and we scroll on over to the archers. Let's do that. Archers. And we get a look. I mean, I don't have this set of equipment. I have this set of equipment, actually. And let's get a look here at the Zhuge Liang Hermann Prime. So 1% all damage is worth about 2% health if you're Ottoman. Let's go with France. I mean, it's about the same. So I'm even just going to approximate some stuff here, right? So I'm going to take 1.5 times 2. So that's worth about 3% health. Actually, the 1.5% all damage worth about 3% health. That's a pretty good roll. That's a pretty good roll. If I had 3% health or higher, that would be better. But like that particular piece, that's a pretty fine outcome. But like over here, you can see this 1% all damage is like subpar compared to fit. That's worth about 2% health. Fit is worth 3.5. Over here, I've got Intrepid, and like, yeah, this is just a re-rolling issue. Up top, I've got Robust still. But this really makes me want to like filter through all my armaments. And this is why I hang on to a lot of armaments. But if I went through all my armaments and we go for, I mean, we'll say health for now, and archers really is what we're talking about. And we select this slot, right? Like what we'd really love to find, well, Spirit and Guarded, damage taken reduction is pretty nice, but I've probably got Fit sitting around like this. Like this is the sort of one where it would get really interesting to re-roll it, particularly for infantry. Like if I could roll both of these stats infantry and have them be high on this account, like that could be kind of an interesting one for my infantry march, although I kind of got a lot going on there already. Here's another fit one with a bunch of re-rolls, right? So like this is an armament where it's like, oh, well, maybe I could do something with this, like meaningfully, actually. So, you know, I could do 1 transmutation stone. It didn't really go anywhere, right? 2.5% infantry health is decent, but it's like not a high roll, which is a bit of a bummer because I just finished saying how important the health is, right? Like, so I could try to build that as an infantry armament. Do I have another fit sitting around? Tragic. I don't. So, you know, if I wanted to do that in this slot, this is what I'd have to work with. Interesting. So that's sort of one of the takeaways that I get from this. So long story short, people have been asking for a long time for Chisgule, give me a very precise breakdown of the relevance of each stat. Man, that's a lot of work, which is why I'm glad Davor has done it. Link will be in the description where you can go check that out. Big shout out again to Ruz and Davor for sharing this with me and talking with me about it. I'm sure there's a lot more that, again, I've kind of oversimplified here, but for the sake of looking at things in this video, I think it's definitely very interesting. And, you know, one final thing I'll just get a look at is that defense is actually even better than health for cavalry. So in this situation, technically speaking, given the gear I have, the inscription for defense would be slightly more useful than the inscription for health. Now, I happen to be using neither, so is what it is, but you kind of get the idea, right? Depending on the combo. And like my combo is it even represented? I'm probably going to use Arthur, and I probably end up needing to use Nevsky. I don't know. That is not in the list. Yeah. Okay. Although I am using Arthur and Philip. You can see how I like get very interested in nerding out on this, but that is also not in the list currently, as well. All right. They got some of the main combos in there, so you get the idea. Gosh, if I go look at, what about like Huo and Joan? Is that in there? Huo Belly Prime is in there. Huo Joan is not in there. Huo Arthur's in there. All right. Well, I'm interested in Huo Joan potentially. And I've got these. So let's get a look at what's on here. I mean, these are pretty good. Enraged and Onslaught, Bluster. Then we've got Artisan and Enduring. So, yeah, I mean, there's not really a choice about defense to be made here. But theoretically, I would prioritize maybe defense on Cav. Although I'd have to look into this particular combo. GG. If you enjoyed the vid, throw a like on here, subscribe. Go check them out. Linked in the description. And if you're looking for some recent videos I did about equipment, we've been talking a lot about accessories recently. I talked about horn and drums in a recent video, which stirred up a fair amount of controversy. Best accessories you might want to use. Check the card in the end screen. I think it's been an interesting dialogue and like, I don't know. We'll see. I probably got to talk about that one, but that's for another vid.